glad you are with us here this evening. What is the most quoted verse in all of the Bible?
In the beginning, God created.
Okay. Where's that found?
Revelation.
Revelation. It's found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1.
Yeah.
Okay. A lot of us would say John 3:16. A lot of us would say that. But believe it or not, Janet is more correct than the rest of us.
Write this day down.
Write this day down, yeah. And I tell you, it surprised me. You know, John brought up about John 3:16 this morning, and what does verse 17 say? We're going to bring up verse 17 here later in our lesson. So don't go looking at it now, because I'm going to ask you here later, what does it say? How many of you know what John 3:17 says? How many of them know? John, surely you know. Pretty much? All right. Well, we're going to bring it up here towards the end of our discussion here tonight. But think about that. What does it say? It might surprise you. It did me when I looked it up this afternoon. Because I felt for sure that John 3:16 was the most quoted verse out of all of the Bible. But there is a media group out in California called Ranker. And on their website, they have polls. And the result of polls. And believe it or not, they have a poll for the most quoted verse in all of the Bible. And John 3:16 comes in at number 4. The first most quoted verse is Proverbs 3:5. The second one is Genesis 1:1. The third most quoted verse is Proverbs 3:6. You would think 3 and 5 would go, or 5 and 6 would go pretty much together. But it is not until the fourth place that you find John chapter 3 and verse 16. Now, I'm not really so sure that I agree with those results. But it is, without a doubt in my mind, the most favorite verse of all Christians. Now, if I was to ask you, what else can be said about John 3:16? What would you say? What else can be said about it? What would you say? Well, here's what I would like to share with you. To me, John 3:16 is the golden text of the Bible. And not only that, but John 3:16 really is the Bible in miniature. Now let's just think about that for just a minute. Now, how can we say that John 3:16 is the Bible in miniature?
Because that's the whole purpose of the Bible.
Okay, the whole purpose of the Bible. What is God showing us from the very beginning of the Scriptures, from Genesis through Revelation? What is He showing us? Okay, that He loves us. And so John 3:16, I believe, is the Bible in miniature. Because God, from the very beginning of time, was showing man how much He loves us. Now, for God so loved the world that He did what? That He gave His only begotten Son. When did God plan on sending His Son? Before creation. And even after his man fell into sin, He revealed that plan, did He not?
Yes, through prophecy.
Okay, through prophecy. Turn to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3. And let's notice what we are told. Notice what we're told in verse 15. Now here by this time man has already sinned. The serpent tempted Eve. She took of the tree. She ate of the tree. She gave unto her husband. He ate thereof. God found them, asked them what they had done. and now the punishment is being dealt out. And in verse 15, notice what God said unto the serpent. God said unto the serpent, I will put enmity between thee and the woman. I will put enmity. Now what does that mean, enmity? What does that mean? Okay, dislike. Strife. You know, dislike is very close. The word enmity in the Hebrew means that there's going to be hostility, there's going to be hatred. And so God is going to put hatred between the serpent and man. Now, who was the serpent?
Satan.
Okay, Satan. And so there's going to be hatred between the woman and Satan, between man and Satan. Well, notice what else God goes on to say. So, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. Let's continue. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Now let's look at a different translation here. Here's the easy English version. God said, I will make you and the woman enemies. Your descendant and her descendant. Well, what is meant here by descendant? What is a descendant?
Offspring.
Okay, an offspring. And so between thy descendant and her offspring will always be enemies, and he will hit your head, and you will hurt his foot. Now, who is God? Almost gave out the answer there. Who is God talking about here? Jesus. Now, somebody might say, no, wait a minute. He's not really mentioned here, but he is.
He's the offspring of Eve.
He is the offspring of Eve. Which brings up another question, brings up a good question. Is Jesus a descendant of Eve?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Now here's what we need to do. We need to prove it. How can you prove that Jesus is a descendant of Eve?
I suppose that awful long genealogy.
With names you can't pronounce.
Names you can't pronounce.
Okay, you do turn to the genealogy. How many times does the genealogy of Christ appear in the New Testament?
Once.
Joe? Twice. It appears twice. Once in Matthew, and where is the second? In the book of Luke. Now in Matthew, the genealogy goes back from, or starts with who? It only goes back as far as Abraham. It starts with Abraham and goes through Christ. But let's notice the genealogy that is found in Luke. Okay, Luke the 3rd chapter. Luke chapter 3. Now we're going to come back to Genesis here in just a minute. So let's go to Luke chapter 3. Now here is the second time in which the genealogy appears. And it goes beyond Abraham, goes beyond Noah, and goes all the way back to, well, as soon as we get there, Luke chapter 3. Let's notice verse 30 of that passage. Okay, how far back does the genealogy go? Verse 38, I'm sorry. Verse 38, the genealogy begins in verse 23. It begins with Jesus and goes all the way back through Abraham, all the way back through Noah, and all the way back into verse 38, which was the son of Enos, which was the son of Seth, which was the son of who? Adam. And so Jesus is, without a doubt, a descendant of Eve. Okay? And so God said what the descendant of Eve was going to do what? In Genesis chapter 3.
Bruise his head.
Going to bruise his head. But you're only going to hurt his heel. All right, you have a wound to the head. What happens?
Well, it can be fatal.
It can be fatal. And is that what God here is prophesying?
Yes.
that Jesus is going to destroy Satan. He's going to destroy the power of Satan. All right, so let's go back. Let's go back to John chapter 3 and verse 16. Because here we do have the Bible in miniature. And from the very beginning of Genesis, when God said he was going to send his son, all the way through, God is telling us about the love that he has for us. He's going to send his son. In fact, if someone asked you, what is John 3:16 teaching? What would you tell them? What would you tell them? What is John 3:16 teaching? That God loved the world. That God loved you and I. The Apostle John, in 1 John, talks about a manifestation. 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3. And let's read, or 1 John chapter 4, and let's read verses 9 through 10.
3 or 4?
4. 1 John chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. In this was manifested the love of God towards us. What does manifested mean? Okay, made known. To make visible. Okay, for it to appear for all to see. Okay, so what was being made known or visible unto all men? 1 John chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. 1 John chapter 4. I apologize for saying chapter 3. It is these things.
Well,
Okay? Unless I have it right here.
What translation you read now?
King James. King James. For this was manifested the love of God towards us. You in 1 John? You in 1 John chapter 4?
I'm in 5. It don't read the same.
Okay, now I didn't say 5, did I?
now you said 3, and then you said 4.
And then I said 4. And so he automatically goes to 5. Okay, and this was manifested. Okay, manifested, John said, means to make visible. And that's exactly right. To make visible. So what is God making visible to us?
His love for us.
Okay, his love for us. Okay, now let's look at this verse a little bit closer. Look at it a little bit closer. For in this was manifested the love of God towards us, because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world, that we might live through him. Okay, so he sent his only begotten Son into the world, and through this was made known his love. His love was made visible in the sending of his only begotten Son. Anybody have a different translation here? When it comes to the phrase, only begotten Son. Anybody have a different translation? Well, there are some translations who instead...
That means one of a kind.
Okay, one of a kind.
One translation uses the word unique.
Unique. International Standard uses the word unique. There are other translations. For example, the Easy English, the Bible in Basic English, the Revised Standard, instead of reading here, his only begotten Son, reads his only Son. In fact, the New English translation reads his one and only Son.
Yeah, the contemporary English says only Son, so these agree.
Okay, and the contemporary English says that, his only Son. Now, I can certainly understand why they're translating it that way. But really, is that a good translation? Okay, TJ shaking his head no. John says not really. Okay, why is it not a good translation? In your opinion?
Because we can all be sons.
Okay, we can all be sons of God. And it's, I can understand why they're translating it that way and what they are meaning when they're translating it that way. And I'll mention that in just a minute. But really, it is not as good a translation as the King James here. It's not really as good a translation as his one and only. No, I'm sorry. It's not as good a translation as his unique Son in the International Standard Version. It's not as good a translation as his only born Son. What is meant here by begotten? What is meant here by begotten?
Father of.
Okay, father of.
Strong says only born.
Okay, only born. Okay, only born.
Single of its kind in the Greek.
Okay.
Yeah, single of its kind in Greek.
Okay, now say that again.
Single of its kind.
Okay, single of its kind. The word begotten. Now, Mark said just a moment, his only born Son. That is the meaning of begotten. Okay? TJ is John's only begotten son. His only born son. Now, of course, John has other children, but TJ is his only born son. That would be a better translation than some of the ones that we have. His only born son. Now, I understand when it talks about his one and only, they're really saying his one and only born son. But it can be misleading because John said that he has other sons. Now, does God have other sons?
Yes.
Yes.
We're all sons and daughters through Christ.
Okay, we're all sons and daughters through Christ. All right. Now, turn back to John. Go to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. There's a lot of people who would say, well, no, God doesn't have any other sons. But that would be really not a very scriptural idea. John chapter 1. Now, we're going to come back to 1 John 4 here in just a minute. But let's go to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. Let's read what we're told in verses 11. In fact, let's begin in verse 10. Let's go 10, 11, and 12. Does God have other sons? Well, beginning in verse 10. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. Now, who's him? Okay, Christ. Now, all right, let's follow this correctly. Him is referring back to light in the previous 3 verses. Okay, so who then is the light? Jesus is the light. Okay, he was in the world. Jesus was in the world. And the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came into his own, and his own received him not. Okay, so Jesus came into his own, and they didn't receive him. Who's being talked about here? Who's being referred to here? Okay, the Jews. The Jews did not receive him. Why was John sent? Do you remember? Why was John Baptist sent?
He was to prepare the way.
To prepare the way. He was to prepare the way. He was to prepare his followers to be Christ's followers. He was to prepare the Jews to follow him. But there were those who did not receive him. Now, did everybody not receive him?
No, there was some who did.
Okay, there were some who did. Okay, going on in verse 12. But as many as received him. What does it mean to receive?
Accept.
That's exactly right. It means to accept. In fact, the Easy English version reads, as many as accepted him. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become what? Sons of God. How many times do we hear today, all you got to do is accept Jesus and you're God's son? Is that a mistranslation of this verse? It is without a doubt. A mistranslation, a misunderstanding of this passage. Because nowhere are we told here that all of those who received him, and receive means what? Accept. Nowhere are we told here that all those who accept him became sons of God. We're not told that. But rather, they were given what?
Power to become.
Okay, they were given the power or the right or the privilege to become sons. The fact that they were given the right or the privilege indicates what? What does that indicate? Okay, they had a choice to make. And there were other things that they had to do besides just accept him. Believing him, having faith in him, accepting him is not enough. You've got to repent, you've got to confess, you've got to be baptized. And it is then that you become sons of God. And if you are sons of God, you are what? Well, Romans tells us, the apostle tells us in Romans chapter 8, that if we are the children of who? Children of God. If we are God's son, if we're God's daughter, are we his children?
Yes.
Exactly right. And so if we are God's children, then we are his what? Heirs. We are heirs with God and joint heirs with Christ. Okay, in Romans chapter 8, 16 and 17. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. So be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. And so, are there other sons of God? Yes. All those who accept him and do what? And obey him.
But be baptized and
Okay.
obey.
And obey. Who continue on and do the things that God requires. And so God does have other sons. And so when you go back to 1 John chapter 4, verse 9 and 10, the better translation here is not only son, or one and only, although we understand what they're saying. The better translation is the only born, or the only begotten Son of God.
Yeah, so the King James Version is correct.
In a way they translated this, yes, it is correct. And there's also, I forget which translation it is, maybe Dave can look it up real quick, but there is a translation that reads the only born Son. That is also the better translation. You know, all of them we can understand. I can understand what they're saying, the other translations. But it can be misleading for some to think that God doesn't have any other sons. But he does. Okay. In this was manifested the love of God towards us, because that God sent his only begotten Son into the world, that we might live through him. And so God showed his love unto all of us through the sending of his only begotten Son. That we might what? Okay, that we might live, that we might have eternal life. Why did God send his Son into the world? Okay, he loves us. What's John 3:17 say? Okay, now you've had some time to think about it. Well, you've had all day to think about it. 14 and 15, you know, John said, what's verse 15 say? Well, you also got to include verse 14 in that, because they go together. Moses lifted up the serpent, and therefore the Son of Man must be lifted up. That's 14 and 15. Then we have 16. Then we have 17. God sent his Son into the world not to what? Not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. And really, friends, when you stop and you think about that, That shouldn't be hard for us to remember what verse 17 says, or even what 14 and 15 has to say. He sent his Son into the world not to condemn the world, but that we through him might have life.
So the world really already condemned itself.
The world condemned itself when sin entered into the world and when we continue in sin. All right, so in the fact that God sent Jesus into the world, we see the love of God. We see the love of God in that he sent him to be, as we're told in verse 10, to be our propitiation. What does propitiation here mean?
That's a word Janet uses every day.
Okay, use that every day.
I can't remember what it means.
The word propitiation in the Greek means to make peace. And so he sent him into the world that peace might be made. Peace might be made between who? God and man. Between God and man. There is how much he loves us. We see that in the fact that he sent his Son. We see that in the fact that he didn't send his Son to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. We want to extend the invitation. If we have anyone here this evening who needs to come in obedience, we encourage you to do so here tonight. If you're someone who has erred in your faith, we encourage you as well to come and to make things right with the Father. Won't you come tonight, friends? Why together we stand and we sing.